The requirements would apply to new construction of new buildings, enlargements of existing buildings over a certain size, or conversions of non-residential buildings to residential of over 10 units. The location of the affordable units could be within the same building, in a separate building on site, which would be completely independent from the ground to the sky, and would not in some way stigmatize occupants of affordable units by putting the entrance near the dumpster or something of that nature. And they could be off-site on a different zoning lot, entirely located within the same community district or within a half-mile of the site that was being developed for market rate housing. Other considerations, there would be a payment in lieu option for small buildings, and this is really necessary to avoid a situation in which only 2 or 3 affordable housing units might be provided, and where there will be a difficult regulatory situation both for the developer and for the city. And there would be a safety clause which is necessary to ensure that the program meets legal requirements. And I would say that where a project that provided affordable housing was genuinely infeasible economically, the Board of Standards and Appeals would be permitted to provide relief. Mandatory inclusionary housing, as we talked about earlier, is part of only one of many components of the mayor's housing plan that work together. Other components that are important are the strategic use of subsidy programs, where in neighborhoods where you really need to have subsidies to provide affordable housing. The reform of the 421A program, which is extremely important in making the economics of this mandatory inclusionary housing work, and it's designed to work in tandem with the recently enacted changes to 421A. And the zoning for quality and affordability, which will ensure that city subsidies, rather than being used to underwrite inefficient aspects of current zoning requirements, will really be used to benefit the maximum number of people in the city who are in need of affordable housing. And so the process, as I talked about earlier, we're enacting now, trying to enact now, a zoning text amendment to establish the program, and it will be applied over time. The first case in which it is being applied is the currently proposed East New York rezoning, and there will be other rezonings coming through the public review process in the future, including in this borough. And it will also be applied to private applications that produce a significant amount of new housing. And that brings us to zoning for quality and affordability.
Sure, that'd be great. Before I open it up for questions,
so I'm going to talk about one of the key sort of puzzle pieces that Eric just mentioned on a previous slide, the zoning for quality and affordability proposal. I believe many of you heard an earlier version of this presentation back in the spring, but of course, since we've entered the public review process, we now have a proposal and we're ready for your feedback. So the goals are sort of twofold. One is affordability. We want to, through this zoning text amendment, make zoning work better with financial and other programs to create more affordable housing for a wider range of New Yorkers. And quality, encourage better buildings that contribute to attractive and livable neighborhoods. These can work together. Under the affordability umbrella, we have sort of 3 primary spokes. The first relates to affordable senior housing and care facilities. We're hoping to help seniors remain in their communities by making it easier to provide housing for this population. Second, support the creation of inclusionary housing. And third, free up resources to create more affordable housing by enabling cost-effective and transit-accessible affordable housing. So the first, relating to helping seniors remain in their communities. Eric touched on this on the previous slides, but why does zoning need to change? As we've mentioned, the population age 65 and older is projected to increase citywide by 40% by 2040, and this amounts to over 400,000 additional seniors citywide. Slightly lower percentage in Queens, 30%, with 90,000 additional seniors here. Today's zoning doesn't recognize the current spectrum of senior housing and affordable care facilities, We have uses such as independent living facilities for seniors, assisted living, nursing care, and our zoning resolution today doesn't really effectively distinguish different uses in the types of way that we see these uses being developed elsewhere around the country. In medium and higher density zoning districts, affordable senior housing is currently allowed more floor area than general residential developments, but the zoning doesn't allow the room for all of it to fit in a well-designed building. Although we allow greater floor area ratios, which is effectively more density, we don't actually create a larger building envelope to fit this additional density. So the result, and I'll get into more detail on subsequent slides, is a building that's typically flat and sort of the floors are squished to fit into the existing building envelope, which really wasn't designed to accommodate the additional floor area that we'd like to see for these uses. In lower density zoning districts, the zoning envelope is also based on sort of the existing residential framework, which are walk-up residential buildings. These are lower density zoning districts that may still accommodate multifamily housing, but they're townhouses, you have stairs, you have other things that don't really work for this type of affordable senior housing that we allow in these districts, but again, don't really allow the appropriate envelope to accommodate things like elevators and other sort of amenities that seniors especially need. So in medium and high density districts, in order to fulfill the goal of helping seniors remain in their communities, we want to update the regulations to allow a spectrum of affordable senior housing and care facilities, both standalone or mixed. And when I say standalone, I mean a standalone, independent, affordable residence for seniors, or a sort of mixed model that we see elsewhere in the country and where we know that there's interest to build in the city today that allows for sort of a graduating variety of care offered within one building. So for example, independent living, if you're over the age of 62, that allows you to transition into more sort of assisted living facility, and then allows you to transition into something like a nursing home all under one roof. Zoning today, again, doesn't really provide the clear means for developing a building like that, and we see tremendous value in allowing something like that in the city. So what we are proposing to do in medium and high density districts when buildings provide affordable senior housing, first of all, allow a limited additional height to fit all of the floor area within a well-designed building. We don't see why we should sacrifice either dwelling units or design in order to create affordable senior housing. And then at the same time, where we have sort of confusing regulations in the zoning resolution that require different floor areas for different types of affordable senior housing and for assisted living and nursing homes, we're going to reconcile those to make it much easier and clearer for a builder of this type of housing to understand how he or she can mix these uses within the same facility. So how much additional height is needed for affordable senior housing and care facilities? In medium and high density districts, in over 95% of affected zoning districts, no more than 1 or 2 additional stories. And here you see in an R7A on the left, we have an existing envelope where the building is limited to a height of 80 feet. On the right, under our proposal, we would allow them to go up to 105 feet. But again, we would be, well, what we would be doing, although we would be allowing them additional height, we would be placing restrictions on the number of stories that can fit. So we would be preventing developers from simply replicating the existing situation where they're squishing many, many units into substandard sort of floor to ceiling heights. And we would simply be facilitating the development of the existing floor area ratios or existing densities that we allow today, but in a well-designed, appropriate building for these uses. So looking at this sort of existing streetscape context, this was drawn from the perspective of a pedestrian standing across the street. We have the existing envelope for an R7A building on a narrow street. What you can sort of tell here is that, well, what you can't tell is that the existing envelope cannot accommodate the permitted floor area. So what we're showing you is a building that is reasonably well designed, but simply cannot fit all of the dwelling units that we allow for an affordable senior housing development. You also see the restrictive building envelope encourages flat facades and has no street wall lineup. There's very little articulation on the facade of the building. If you look to the left and the right, you see things like bay windows and articulation on the building on the right. There's simply not the room in the building envelope to accommodate things like that under the existing zoning regulations. So what we're proposing to do, by allowing simply 1 or 2 stories, both the permitted floor area can be accommodated within the proposed building envelope, while also allowing for more flexible wall articulation and lineup with the buildings next door. Simply by adding 1 or 2 stories, we sort of give the building room to breathe and add things like either bay windows or recesses off the street, as well as fitting all of the allowable density. We're not proposing to change the floor area ratios for most forms of affordable senior housing, so we're not, expecting more units to be generated as a result of this, but by giving them a little bit more flexibility in the building envelope, we will expect to see them both in better buildings and better accommodated within neighborhoods. So our regulations in lower density districts our proposed regulations in lower density districts are designed to accommodate the building types that affordable senior housing really needs. The goals are the same. We want to allow seniors to remain in their communities, and we want to update regulations where they're inappropriate to allow a spectrum of affordable senior housing and care facilities. But what we've heard from providers of this type of housing and what we know from residents is that by allowing affordable senior apartment buildings with 4 to 6 stories, we enable the development of a building with an elevator and with amenities that we deem critical for this type of housing. We do not see today a lot of affordable senior housing built in our lower density multifamily zoning districts, simply because the zoning envelope is entirely inappropriate for this type of housing. So what we're proposing to do is modify the building envelope in order to facilitate the development of a housing type that works for these residents. So what does this look like? On the left, you have the existing R4 envelope, where you have a sort of low density or low scale neighborhood. You have 2 stories or 3 stories within an envelope that was really designed for a general residential building, a pitched roof, etc. What this does is it forces the building low, because a pitched roof really doesn't work for affordable senior housing. And you're left leaving a lot of floor area on the table, and also left with a building model that as I mentioned, doesn't work. So what we're proposing on the right is a building envelope that would allow a taller building, between 45 and 65, or up to 65 feet, or 4 to 6 stories tall in total. But what this does is enable the construction of an elevator within the building, and dramatically sort of increase the number of units that can be built in these districts, enabling seniors to stay in their communities, assuming that they may live nearby today. Again, we have the floor area ratios already allowed in these districts, but we just don't have the envelope to accommodate them. So again, from the sort of sidewalk perspective, here's a 4 to 6 story building. This one is 5 floors. Showing you how it fits in a typical sort of R32, R4, R5 lower density multifamily zoning district. So moving on to the second component of the affordability is supporting the creation of inclusionary housing. In designated medium and higher density zoning districts today, the inclusionary housing program promotes mixed income housing. These are mapped inclusionary housing designated districts. However, like senior housing, inclusionary housing is allowed more floor area, but the zoning also does not allow room for it all to fit in a well-designed building. The same way I mentioned for affordable senior housing, we give additional floor areas, but we give additional density or floor area ratio for most types of affordable senior housing. We do for inclusionary housing as well. However, we do not give a larger building envelope to accommodate this additional density. So as a result, you typically get either for buildings that are participating in the program, sort of lower floor to ceiling heights, a flat facade, buildings that are generally designed to fit all of the floor area and not provide any additional articulation or amenities, or as we see in many cases in the mapped inclusionary housing districts, simply less participation in the program and less affordable housing. It's not a required program today. Eric mentioned, our proposal to make it mandatory, but under the existing framework, we just don't see as much as we'd like to see because it's not really it doesn't result in a well-designed building, and it often requires developers to leave floor area on the table that we have expressly given them in order to encourage this type of housing. So in order to fulfill the goal of supporting the creation of inclusionary housing, what we're proposing to do is when buildings participate in the voluntary inclusionary housing program, or in the future in the mandatory inclusionary housing program, allow the same height as we're proposing for buildings that are providing affordable senior housing. So generally, as I mentioned, in 95% of the affected zoning districts in the city, this amounts to 1 to 2 additional stories over what is allowed today and what would in the future still be allowed for general residential buildings. This would apply anywhere where the voluntary inclusionary housing program exists today or in future mapped mandatory inclusionary housing districts. So the third component of the affordability sort of umbrella of this proposal is freeing up resources to create more affordable housing by enabling cost-effective, transit-accessible, affordable housing. Why does zoning need to change? Our current parking requirements make it harder to meet the need for affordable housing. Structured parking can cost up to $30,000 or even up to $50,000 per parking space to provide. Structured parking is typically required when you're building infill development in dense neighborhoods and where you simply don't have the lot area to just pave and provide surface parking. Because it costs so much to provide parking, it also typically costs money to park in these spaces in order for the developer or operator to recoup the cost of development. So residents of affordable housing are unwilling or unable to pay the fees necessary to support the cost of constructing the parking. This can cost $200 to $300 a month, and